Hey everyone, thank you for joining us for this special Change Nerd session. Today we're going to be talking about why we are afraid to discuss race in the workplace. Given everything that's happening in the world, we thought it would be appropriate to start having more social conversations, and we wanted to open it up to experts and other Change Nerd members. So here we are. We're going to jump into introductions. Stephanie, you want to go first?
Oh, yeah. Hi, everybody. I know most of you, but obviously I'm Stephanie Waits. I am co-founder of ChangeNerd with Brian Hampton. We're the dynamic duo. I'll just sort of underscore that, and just really grateful to be here. I'm in the healthcare space at the moment. My background's really in education, leadership development, and change. So I have a huge passion around culture and really using learning, engagement, all those fancy sort of terms to really be levers to drive long-term change and sustainable change.
Absolutely. Thank you, Stephanie. All right, so I'll just follow the Brady Bunch board. Angela, can you go next?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Angela Howard. I work as an executive coach helping founders, business owners build human-centric workplaces. So currently, the main organization I'm working with is a small family-owned business called Dover. So I serve as their VP of People Development and HR.
Awesome. Thank you, Angela. Christy.
Hi, everyone. I am Christy Moody. I am an organizational change manager at HCSC, which is the parent company for some of the Blue Cross Blue Shield in 5 states, and really enjoy just kind of the change space, organizational culture, stakeholder engagement, and comms aspect of it.
Awesome. Thanks, Christy. Ed?
Hey everyone, Ed Shaw. I'm from Penn State University. I'm an organizational change management consultant there. Backgrounds in IT, networking specifically, and for the last 4 years have been working to establish an organizational change management discipline, if you will, at Penn State.
Great, thank you, Ed. Joe?
Hi, I'm Joe McDermott. I have my own consulting business, Catalyst for Change Consulting. I've been in that organization for 20 plus years and have worked for probably 40 different companies or organizations across all those years. My specialty is large, complex IT projects, but I've also done culture and organization effectiveness, lean. So I've had a range of experiences. And this is a subject that's very near and dear to my heart. So I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, Joe, thank you for joining. All right, Colin?
Hey, Colin, Mulholland. I lead the org change and transformation practice at Change Healthcare. I've found a love for people first work, starting to explore that on a side hustles with mission focused organizations as well. Fired up to be here.
Yeah, no, thanks for joining. Celina Wilson.
Hi, yes, Celina Wilson. I am currently and historically focused in the nonprofit sector. Currently serve as the Vice President of Organizational Effectiveness for the East Oakland Youth Development Center. I also work with a global consulting firm called Decolonize Design, and we focus on providing an alternative to the standard diversity, equity, and inclusion status quo. And focusing on marginalized communities. Historically, I also have experience doing change management consulting work in the corporate sector as well.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining. Onika?
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Onika Cornelius. I currently have my own shingle, so to speak, Convergent Solutions. Yeah. Here out of the Atlanta metro area. My background is across the talent continuum. So whether it's talent development and management through learning and collaboration, change and journey management, and workforce transformation and org effectiveness. I've had the opportunity to work both with organizations internally, standing up change management COEs in organizations as part of their HR business strategy, as well as working in some pretty huge and significant organizations internally, and background also in management consulting. Over 9.5 years with one of the big five. So I've had the opportunity to, and the honor to serve cross industry. My passion is really around, from a change perspective, is really around change leadership and change sustainability. I'm a firm believer that without those two, no change really happens.
Yeah.
And for me, it's all about the people side of it. And so I see my job as always being the one in the room who will ask how a business decision, a financial decision, an impact or a transformation, at the end of the day, what happens to people. And so I think that might be why I got invited to this party.
Absolutely. No, thank you for coming. Thank you all for coming. I mean, as we're hearing the introductions, it's so cool to see how we're all connected in multiple ways, not just through change management. So thank you for coming to the party. I want to call out a few names of people who are very, very important. Over the last several months, I think the world has seen several Black people being murdered. We have George Floyd, who was murdered on May 25th. Breonna Taylor, March 13th, Ahmaud Arbery, February 23rd. And then we also had the Central Park event in New York with Amy Cooper on May 25th. And these are events that the world saw in addition to the COVID-19 pandemic. So my question to the panel, how are you feeling? How are you currently dealing with this?
So I'll chime in. So, you know, I think traumatized is one of the words that comes to mind. I think this has brought on a whole nother level and layer of trauma in addition to COVID-19, and it's layering on top of each other. So I think a little bit of trauma and also a really strong sense of responsibility, an extremely strong sense of responsibility. So to keep it short, those are the kind of the two things that come to mind immediately.
Yeah. Stephanie, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, and I'll echo you. You know, I think all of us on this call can agree that, you know, these concepts, they're not new, right? These are things that have been happening for hundreds of years. And now it's this, you know, why now? Why all of a sudden is there this ignition of, you know, this electrification in the air? All of a sudden there's this huge movement. It's, you know, and Brian had identified this earlier. It's really, you know, another civil rights movement, right? And I think, you know, Angela, you had mentioned that we're going through this trauma. I would say that, you know, people are also going through this survival mode, right? You had mentioned COVID-19. I was in Denver this past weekend, and there was this beautiful mural that someone was painting about parallel pandemics. And they were saying it's COVID-19 and racism. Mm-hmm. And it's these parallel pandemics that are occurring. And it's, you know, to your point, it's about responsibility. What can I do? What have I been doing? How do I turn up the volume? You know, it's this enormous sense of also looking at others and not necessarily being critical for what they're not doing or what they are doing, and noting that other individuals, anything that's small that can add to the critical mass of continue to move towards this anti-racist, really multicultural, you know, society or organization, depending on if you're internal, I think is going to be now more than ever so important. I think, you know, Brian and I were talking a lot about the why now question, and part of that was with George Floyd. There wasn't anything you could like explain away. You couldn't say, oh, well, he was running away, so therefore, which I often heard people say, and it was this rationalization. And there isn't an opportunity now to explain away what occurred. It was police brutality. It was a murder of a Black man for no reason. So at the end of the day, it's being able to say those words as well. So I think helping my counterparts or helping people around me, and even myself, just really getting continuously comfortable and being able to say those words, you know, white privilege, white comfort, racism, you know, saying, you know, key terms that most people feel very uncomfortable sharing. So how can we even have a conversation about it if we can't even say those specific words? So
I know. And it was, and after the events happened, I know, Christy, you reached out, Colin, Onika, Stephanie, we had Celina, we had conversations, Angela. It was like, we have to, after having the conversations in private, I thought it would be better, like connecting with Stephanie. It's like, we have to have these conversations in an open forum. Because there are other people who want to, but they don't feel comfortable, or maybe they don't have the right forum. Colin, anyone else want to jump in and share their thoughts? How are you? How are you moving through the world right now?
Yeah, I think at the first part of it, it was grief and shame. I think grief from a loss of human life, and acknowledging shame that I have the privilege of looking a certain way and being born into a certain zip code. Early on in my career, having taught in inner city Atlanta for 3 years, having gone back and served in the education system a second time, like tying names to real lived experiences that I thought I could relate to. And I think this just kind of drove it way deeper, that where I am now is curiosity and empathy. And I think it's that deeper introspection. It's been these conversations. It's been tears of those who were finally allowed to let them go in public.
Yeah.
Maybe not even allowed themselves to kind of say like, hey, this is not new. This is my life. That allowed me to stay quiet longer, to listen and then to ask like, what is helpful? So trying to get back into those communities around folks where things that I have learned from change, from leading systemic change and human experience loops to help them navigate sustainable paths to change is kind of where I started and kind of where I'm in, and still making sense of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Anybody else want to jump in?
Yeah, I think that I could kind of describe how I've been feeling on like two ends of a continuum or whatever of discouragement and hopefulness, right? So the discouragement, what Colin was just saying, the shame, the grief, and just the fact that, every day or other day when I get the email that still the officers who shot Breonna Taylor haven't even been let go of the force, much less prosecuted. That's the discouragement of like, how is this like not changing yet? But then the hopefulness of like this discussion and other groups that I'm part of that are having discussions like these and discussions with my family or friends or stuff that we just never had before. And that makes me hopeful that this time eventually something will change. So.
Yeah.
I think it's very interesting when we talk about these discussions, because the reality of it is those of us in the African American community, we have lived these discussions. It's so, so there's sometimes the dichotomy of that, in that it feels very new for people that don't have to live the experience. And, I shared with someone, they're like, well, how are you doing? I said, you have to understand that this has been, we've sat in this space and with this emotion for generations. And so what we've had to do was find ways to function highly and compartmentalize and have those conversations in what I call sacred spaces. And so a lot of times when these conversations aren't happening, it's because the psychological safety doesn't exist to have them. It's not for lack of desire. It's not for lack of need, quite honestly. It's, where can I put this burden down where it is safe for me to do so? And so, if you ask the question, at least for me, I think what has been very telling is that I think, and I could be wrong, I'm interested in hearing other thoughts. I think a lot of what created so much exposure, quite frankly, is the fact that we were sitting in the midst of a pandemic, that there was an audience, that there were so many people that did not have the throes of daily life and routine and ritual and activity and the busy that captures us all. I think that we were literally a captive audience, literally. And so in the midst of that, and already having emotions and fears and anxieties that were raw and were open, here come these events. And so, if you could call those things a perfect storm, I think that's what we're sitting in. And so, the emotions, they are, I appreciate Christy's point, it is, it can be a roller coaster. But definitely not new.
Yeah. But there is a newness to it, in that the conversations are breaking out of those sacred spaces. For example, a friend of mine who is a school board member facilitated a young person's conversation on Zoom with probably 30 speakers, most of whom were African American, and the conversation was equivalent to that which would happen in a sacred space, except there was an audience of 2,000. And it just blew my mind. It blew my mind that something has happened that allows this to spill out, and that people were seeing it seeing and hearing it for the first time in a way that they couldn't diminish, they couldn't walk away from, they couldn't pretend, well, that's over there. This was our community. These were our kids. These people were giving example after example after example, real life. And so I've had that experience, and then I had an experience in this class that I facilitated where, and I think it was a multi-week class that was 1 day a week. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's spread over 4 weeks. So the second week was right after the George Floyd experience, and there were some African American folks in the class, and I so felt the tension, but the old white men who were the gurus, I mean, they were kind of oblivious to it. And one of the individuals, I mean, she couldn't stand it. She went off. And, everybody was just sitting there like, what's happening? What's happening? And, but the whole group dealt with it, and it's just not something that would have happened in the past. So, and then there was another experience where there's a young executive who I coach, who called me and said her boss, who's a senior executive, was going to have a session with his 100 group organization on 1 hour on the subject of race. And he asked people to put in questions, and she shared the questions. I'm like, this is not 1 hour. This is not, I mean, it was on Zoom. This is not going to work. Mm-hmm. I was so wrong, because what they had selected like 3 minority people to talk, and they were very follow the rules talk, and then a white person said, I have to say something. And it was, I feel bad. I don't know what to do with it. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to make it better, but I need somebody to help me figure out how to make this better. And it just broke loose 100 people. And this young woman who described it to me said it was the most extraordinary experience. Everybody was crying, and that she believed real progress was made in that setting. And I'm going, in an hour? She said, well, it was an hour and a half. I'm like, in an hour and a half? And it's like, whoa. But these things are happening. So, it's momentum. How do we keep it going? How do we act on it? How do we make it grow? These are the things that it's a tremendous opportunity for us right now, and I don't want to lose it.
No, Joe, thank you for sharing. Celina, you wanted to contribute real quick?
Yeah, I think what Anika said about the emotional roller coaster really resonates with me, and it's been a lifelong coaster, and I feel very weary sometimes, like legit exhausted. And I think a lot of Black people feel that way. And I vacillate between that weariness and feeling really energized around, like, kind of to Angela's point, you feel like a certain responsibility. Like our ancestors, I remind people all the time, like the bus boycott was 381 days. When we watch these movies looking back, it seems like everything was resolved in a week. It was over a year of Black people boycotting buses just to be able to sit where you want, right? And so I think that there's the challenge of feeling tired, but then feeling a commitment to continuing the work of our ancestors, and sometimes feeling like, what, am I not making enough sacrifices like they made? And, again, vacillating between feeling inspired and hopeful about what feels a little different about this moment, but then also feeling skeptical about, like, when we fall into this symbolism and you're like, oh, Congress is up here in kente cloth, like, no thank you. You know what I'm saying? Like, I get concerned that, okay, is this going to be more posturing, more kind of like symbolic gestures? Are we really about to get into this systemic change, which is what we want? And so I'm continually challenging myself and other people not to get comfortable and complacent. As folks have mentioned, it's like, yes, we're seeing a lot of energy around George Floyd, and yet, Breonna Taylor still has not had justice. Countless folks still have not had justice. There's still so many systemic issues with policing and imprisonment in this country. So it's like, we got to keep going, but we're so tired. And, so yeah, it's just a mix of very complex feelings. And even the sense that, like, yes, Black lives matter, but so does Black prosperity. So does Black joy. So does, it's just like the standard that we're fighting for is so basic. And sometimes that in and of itself feels so dehumanizing. I just have to say my life matters. Mm-hmm. And that is controversial, let alone talking about our prosperity and our joy and our well-being. So, it is a struggle, to say the least.
So I'll share that, I wanted to, I saw this and I wanted an opportunity to learn. While I'm at Penn State, which is, a large institute, it's still in central Pennsylvania, in rural Pennsylvania. And I live about a half an hour away in a small town of about 2,000 people. And the newness that Joe talked about is something that we have experienced here with protests. And quite frankly, it's the first that I can ever remember. I grew up in this area. It's the first I can ever remember. So much so that it actually, there's tension between, I'll just say that there's tension. And, we actually had to go through and censure a supervisor, a township supervisor, and discuss First Amendment rights and everything. So the fact that this is, I hate to say that I'm almost ashamed to say that it's coming to a small town in central Pennsylvania, but there is a newness to it that, I joined this to learn and to hear the conversation, and not necessarily I didn't necessarily have much to contribute. I'm ashamed to say, but I think that is one thing I wanted to share is that newness, the intensity with it is something that is coming here, and looking forward to seeing what this, how we move forward.
Yeah, Ed, thank you for just being here and sharing your thoughts on it. In preparation for this session, I was super nervous. Stephanie knows, for those of you who know me and Stephanie, we're very iterative people, right, Stephanie? And so, right, Christy? So I didn't know how to really scope this session and everything. And I want to thank Colin for really pushing to say, no one really knows the solution. No one can really prescribe anything, but we just need to have the conversation. So Colin, thank you for that bit of inspiration. Joe, you were talking about some great examples in the workplace, and I want to kind of get to the heart of the matter. Why are we afraid to discuss race in the workplace? I think through everyone's kind of testimony, we all agree that things are not sitting quite right on the inside of us, given all the incidents that are happening in America right now. But it seems like when you get to the workplace, it's either not being addressed or it's not being addressed effectively. So let's answer two questions. Why are we generally afraid to discuss race in the workplace? And what can we do? Second question, what can we do to foster closer relationships between employees and close relationships, trust, and get the general employee population just to assume positive intent when one colleague communicates with another colleague and, you know, reaches out about these really sensitive issues. So going back to the first question, why are we generally afraid to discuss race in the workplace? Any thoughts?
Ryan, just to kind of put a book in on the last segment,
Yeah.
I think it's worth naming. This is new for some of us. This newness is new for some of us. And I felt like there was a thread there that Onika brought into the space. Like, this has been lived very differently for all of us. But I think the newness must be named as well as new for some of us. Some of the discomfort has been a daily part of life that I can't appreciate or understand the depth, but just wanted to name that. It wasn't settling for me. Just wanted to name that newness has been lived on a day-to-day basis for others.
So sort of related to that, my answer to your question was, it's because there are multiple realities here. So for African Americans in the workplace, this isn't new. This, you know, this reality of being a minority and seeing everything through what I think are more realistic eyes has been there. But for white people, I saw today and shared on Facebook, but I'd be glad to share with this group a blog post by a woman who, the title of it is "When I Found Out I Was White," or something like that. There's a reality that most people walk around in that it's obliviousness. So at its most benign, it's obliviousness, and then you can go way beyond that to the malicious parts of it. But in the workplace, you know, that boss, his reality is that there isn't a problem. You know, that's his reality. So why discuss it? And certainly why bring the impinge on that reality? Because that makes me uncomfortable. So I just as soon not impinge on my reality. And so everybody's happy here. We all, you know, I've got 2 Black people working for me, so everything's cool. And, you know, I'm nice to them and they're happy to come to work and everything's cool. I mean, that reality, we have to break it down. We have to, and I think that's a little bit of what's gone on in these last 2 months, that people have suddenly, oh my God, that really happened. As opposed to, it, you know, I can put it away and it didn't happen somehow.
Yeah, no, Joe, thank you for that. Angela, you lead an HR organization. So, you know, why do you think, as a head of HR where you are, why do you think we're generally afraid to discuss race in the workplace?
Yeah, part of me thinks that we've kind of, we've put some frosting on the cake. We've called it diversity, equity, and inclusion because that's much easier to digest and speak about. Racism is a dirty word. I mean, it's historically been considered that, and it shouldn't be. And I think one of the reasons why leaders have a hard time speaking those words and talking about them and actualizing them is because we usually use the word in like really covert terms, you know, and it hits people individually. So we talk about racists, and now you've attacked my character, right? Now you've attacked the culture of my organization and the intent. When that's not what it's about. We're really talking about the systemic racism that has built over the years and centuries that you may be contributing to, maybe even subconsciously. And we need to be able to mouth that and put that in our language to actually understand what that means. And the realization that the system wasn't built for everybody, it wasn't designed for everybody, is something that some people just can't swallow. especially because we're such an individualistic culture in the US.
Mm-hmm.
And well, this is a land of opportunity, right? You just got to work hard. You may have to work a little bit harder if you're a person of color, but you just got to work hard. I did it. I'm in quotations, I'm an immigrant, or my parents were from here. I made it happen. So I think that also the fact that we're an individualistic culture also contributes to that.
Yeah, no, thank you for that.
Yeah, I think that, to add to your point, frankly, I think that Western notions of professionalism are inherently dehumanizing to everyone, in the sense that there's this idea that you are supposed to fully compartmentalize yourself, right? And so my professional self is totally separated from my personal self, which, if you really think about it, is a very unhealthy, weird, warped way of being, right? And this is why the work we do at Decolonize Design is really looking at these colonial ideas of what it means to even be professional, and how it centers a dominant culture that frankly has a lot of toxic elements to it in the first place, right? And so, Stanford did a study that talked about and looked at what people consider, professional, and how a lot of these ideas have no actual bearing on one's efficacy in their work, and has everything to do with assimilating to dominant culture, which is white, heteronormative, Judeo-Christian kind of norms, right? And so I think that that's a big part of why we don't talk about race, because we don't talk about ourselves, really, right? Like we're kind of like automatons once we cross that threshold. You might have a very passing surface level conversation around your kids' soccer practice or whatever, but for the most part, people are, hang up their humanity when they clock in, right? And so I think part of it is that we have to Angela's point, get away from this really not just individualistic way of thinking, but compartmentalized way of thinking, right? And really understanding that let people be their full authentic selves. And for Black people, we are taught from a very young age to assimilate in order to be successful, to assimilate in these settings, right? And so, and I talk about, when we talk about inclusion in workplaces, we're really talking about coerced assimilation 9 times out of 10. It's like, we will include you if you act like us, talk like us, do your hair like us, right? So it's like, to a certain extent, we'll include you, but you have to act this way. And so I think part of the key, and I tell this to white folks too, one of the things that used to trip me out when I was in predominantly white settings, sometimes white folks would change the way they would speak to me. So it's like, hey, homegirl, okay, if you don't say that to other people, it's like, you're not being authentic to who you are, which is then making me uncomfortable, right? So it's like, if you speak like that, speak like that. If you don't speak like that, don't speak like that. I think if everybody had a radical commitment to authenticity and a commitment to allowing people to be genuinely who they are, so long as it's respectful to other people, it's like, yo, you can listen to your country western, I can listen to my Afro beats or whatever it is, and we can learn from each other. But this idea that we have to have sameness and some sort of homogeny, I think that's at the root of it. We pretend like we're the same because there's a false notion that we have to know we're more the same than different. It's like, well, I feel like that's a loaded comment. We don't have to be more the same than different to relate to each other. It's like, we're different in some ways, we're the same in some ways, and both are cool. And so, I think that's why we're not comfortable talking about race, because we're not really comfortable being human beings at work. In addition to all of the loaded, the stigma and the denial and the guilt and the shame, there's that, but then there's also just a lack of holistic being in these spaces.
I'm going to jump in on that one, Celina. That was powerful. If I go back to what you asked us, Brian, what I'll say is it is always very difficult to talk about what you have not yet healed from. So when we talk about, having powerful, deep conversations that get to the root of and create and drive and start to build momentum, you don't have those conversations and they be productive from a place of constant and ongoing woundedness. Mm-hmm. You cannot have those valuable conversations that unpack a wealth of emotions until there has been either a level of healing or an agreement that healing will take place in this space. Mm-hmm. And that we also agree that we're going to sit in the discomfort for a while until it happens. And many times organizations, I don't think, relish the importance of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we I say we, meaning collectively as people with heartbeats, we're not allowed to sit in that and think about it,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because sitting and thinking about that, it's going to unpack something that is uncomfortable for someone. The fact that whether it's white, black, brown people, when we're in these conversations, the fact that you feel that weighted silence, it's because there is something there that nobody has been willing to unpack in that environment. And that can happen for a number of reasons. You know, when working with leaders, I don't care how big the transformation is, I always want to sit with them first. And I need to understand and build a relationship with them, because if I'm going to help be the change strategist that you need, I need to be able to tell you the truth. And to be able to tell you the truth, I've got to see how you operate in your environment. I have to see how the environment reacts and changes when you're in the room. Does it get better? Does it get more quiet? Does it get stagnant? Is there now this false sense of whatever, right, that's created because you're in the room? And what that tells me is I have yet to be in an organization where, when I think of the most senior leaders and their personality and how they show up, but they sit in and they lead an organization that has a diametrically different culture. That doesn't happen. Leaders, when you see a leader and you're looking at a culture that may be, whether it's fractured or there is a culture of competition, or even if there's a culture of servant leadership, you find leadership that propagates and looks and acts and breathes and talks and thinks like that. You're not going to have a servant leader over a command and control environment.
Yeah.
That's not what happens, right? And so when we talk about that discomfort, it's not as if it sits in isolation. And I've not met a lot of leaders. There are some that are willing to say, let me take this journey. Those conversations require a level of vulnerability that not everybody is ready to have on that platform, in my opinion.
Yeah, Anika, thank you so much.
I learned last week, it was on a Brave New Work podcast, consulting organization called The Ready, and someone there named Saharan Bao referred to the concept of JEDI, JEDI, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. Yeah. That was new to me. What Angela and Celina and then Anika just ran with, our organizations are built on scientific management and Gantt charts. Scientific management, the history of scientific management, it was started in 1900 based on how to deliver work of slaves better, faster, cheaper, and aligned. The Gantt chart was founded on those same principles. The guy who founded the Gantt chart founded it based off of his father's overseeing of a slave practice. And it's like, wait, like, these are so normalized in our environments. Like, that's so out there, but it has just become how we do it. It dehumanizes over time. In 1911, they shared on this podcast, it was brought in front of a judicial hearing that scientific management and Taylorism may just be slavery reinvented. Mm-hmm. And it went away. The hearing just they didn't get to a consensus that wasn't the case. Like, we are living in these day-to-day patterns. Like, people talk about systemic like it's like new way of thinking. Like, no, these are deeply rooted practices that took shape based off of the backs of people that only looked a certain way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Colin, that was powerful. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing. I didn't realize that. The more I've researched systemic racism and just read books, I mean, it goes so deep. Angela, you're leading an initiative to fight racism in the workplace. You know, I mean, it just goes so deep. So with everything that was discussed today, how can we make it how can we make it more comfortable within organizations to have these uncomfortable conversations? I've been on one side working for a consulting firm where things were happening in society and I was the only Black man in the room and everyone was acting like nothing was happening. And I've also been in an organization working with a good team where we could have these very, very sensitive conversations and things went well. So, how do we get more of uncomfortable conversations happening within the workplace? How do we help, if you were talking to an executive, if you were talking to a CEO, head of HR right now, what would you advise them?
I think, it's been said here many times by many people, but it's that psychological safety. It's that trust that people can open up and have those discussions. And I think it was really powerful what Onika said about, like, we can't have a fruitful discussion if we're getting wounded daily. Like, that's so true. And I hadn't really thought of that before, but it's definitely true. Mm-hmm. And on the same page, like Ed shared, like, he's like, this is new to me. I don't know how, how to act. I'm here to learn. And so people have to be safe to come, wherever they are. And that's leadership, right? Of, making that the norm of that organization, but it's hard to do and it takes time.
Yeah, I think the other piece of it, and you're spot on, Christy. I was sharing with somebody, I think right now what I've been watching, and I know as part of our conversations, whether that was with Brian, with Colin, with Stephanie, for those of us that are in this change space, if this has not been the biggest case study of human behavior in the midst of ambiguity and fear and anxiety and trauma and all of these dynamics at play, and still having to make decisions literally at a global level. What I tell people is that understand this is a marathon, it's not a sprint. This is not an initiative. It is not an event. It is something that you have to be willing to be accountable to dismantle daily. Okay? Mm-hmm. And so it's sitting with leaders and saying, understand that this is going to feel worse before it feels better. There is some excision of what has been infected in our hearts that has to be healed. Okay? Mm-hmm. That in and of itself takes time. The other piece is, I think there is a fallacy that, you can come in and you put in a broad sweeping program, again, thinking very programmatically, and that voila, everybody will come through this in the next 90 days and voila, culture will change. Your culture didn't get to where it was in 90 days. And so to expect that it's going to change and revert back to something, that you've never seen, it's never been, you've never operated in, is not realistic. That's the second piece. The third piece is there's also, I think, a fallacy that, we have to do this with everyone. We got to indoctrinate everyone. No, you need to be really strategic and think about who are our most influential, who have the most authority and influence. And I'm really honest with leaders and say, you are at a point where you are at a fork in a road, and you've got to decide whether or not you've got the right people on board to take you where it is you need to go. And that's a level of just honesty and transparency. You've got to decide who's going to be able to carry this new vision. Every leader or every person that you have in your organization isn't ready for what you are going to need to do. They're not willing. You've got to have that heart reconciliation, right? As leaders, and allow people to do the same. You have to allow people to do the same. I would much rather have, I don't care how large the organization is, if it's about, do I bring your thousands together to have an event to try to change something? Or do I have the meaningful few that are going to carry this and are going to bring it to life and ensure that it continues to live because they are standing on the line to do it? Yeah, no, thank you. That is a very different ask. Mm-hmm. That is a very different ask. And that takes a level of maturity and EQ that I think a lot of leaders and executives they're having to check their own hearts right now. Because you got to decide if you got the appetite for this. This is not an easy one. It doesn't go away with the program. It doesn't go away with a quota. It doesn't go away with a metric. And that's the challenge with this. I said, there is no program that changes our hearts. This is a heart thing. how you show up and how you allow bias or, you know, how you see a people group, how you see an ethnicity, how you see and expect people to show up, because let's be clear, there have been programs before. There have been processes before. There have been things that have been put in place that were supposed to level the field before. And so if we're still talking about it, then what we have to say is that systems don't work on hearts. If that makes sense. This is a heart thing, and you can't legislate heart. You have to make decisions in the heart and then be willing to execute them and walk them out.
Anika, thank you. Stephanie, I know me and you have had so many conversations. You know, what's your perspective on how we can work differently in the workplace?
Yeah, I just want to give a huge shout out to everybody today. I think this is more incredible than Brian and I even imagined as we started to really think this out. A couple of thoughts that I want to piggyback off of many people. Anika, you had really talked about, you know, the culture shift, right? Celina, you talked a lot about sort of trauma. Same with you, Angela, really talking about trauma. I think a couple of things come up for me, right? When we know people are going through trauma or they're not psychologically safe, they're going through this survival mode. It's really about fight or flight. Or the third option, which is sort of the faint, right? We just don't do anything. We just are paralyzed. We're there. And I find, and regardless of, you know, racial status or whatnot, I feel like people are sort of feeling that. They're feeling a fight, a flight, or a faint response. And it's easy to see that. It's easy for me to see it's someone fighting for justice. There's someone out there. And of course, the words fight, flight, or faint can be, you know, defined in different ways. But it's easy for us to bucket individuals into their response to this traumatic event. And I think, you know, Nika, you mentioned earlier, I mentioned it earlier too, like this isn't new. But then Ed, thank you so much for sharing and saying this is new. So it's like this grading, I think, really honoring, and this is what I talk about a lot within my current role, and you know, Brian and I with ChangeNerd, and then also just being involved in the Northwestern MSLOC community, is there's this gradient of experience for people. And you know, Colin, I know you also taught in the inner city, myself included. You know, it's such a special opportunity to be a minority in the room when I'm not the minority traditionally, and being able to build empathy in a way that even gives you a slight, even if it's for a couple of minutes, just a slight understanding of what's going on, you can build that empathetic experience. And then you're able to have those emotional experiences and change and shift your own mental model to become more self-aware about your own white privilege, for myself included. So I think part of this too is, you know, how can we offer individuals, or how can we within the organizational space provide individuals with experience so that they can start to move along that gradient, so this isn't new for them. So they feel that emotionality, they feel a fight or flight response, if you will, hopefully the fight, right? And they're really able to sit in and become more self-aware about where they are along that gradient, so they're able to then self-regulate. You can't get there without deep empathy, right? You can't even get to self-awareness without somebody giving you that feedback. I think the other thing I want to touch on too, Brian, you mentioned this earlier, you and I have had many conversations about this, is, and Celina, I think you mentioned this, you know, coming from, you know, a Black family, you're taught to assimilate. In the white culture growing up, you're taught don't call somebody by their race, you know, denote something by their clothes or their hairstyle or something along those lines. And you know, why is that a bad thing? Why aren't we teaching our kids at a very young age about race? It's not a bad thing. It's all about this heterogeneity and you know, sort of celebration of diversity. And diversity doesn't just mean race. It's across the board. So I'll say that. And then the last thing is, you know, Anika, you talked a lot about culture, and, you know, Celina, I know you're in the MSLOC community too. We learn about like the process of building culture, right? You know, you borrow Ed Shine's model, right, from University of Chicago, where he's got that iceberg model, right? You got all these artifacts up top, how we behave, what our vocabulary is, or, you know, what we wear, how we show up, you know, causes us and should be aligned with the values that are right below the surface. The values aren't explicit, you know, often they're tacit. So, you know, for all of us leading change or leading anything, people function within an organization, it's time to take a really deep look at what are our espoused values, but also what are our actual values. And I think the big thing there is really to say, and then is your organization in alignment with those espoused and actual values? And if they're not, and you're going through this traumatic experience, there's going to be a lot of tension when you're going into work, a huge amount of tension that may not have been there before. And then obviously we look at the deepest part of that that iceberg model, and it's all about assumptions. So we see something, we have a value around it, or we assign a value, and then I make an assumption about it. We're asking people right now with deeply, almost alarming, embedded mental models about how they grew up with race. And we're collectively seeing that within an organization. We're shifting the organization, but we're not necessarily going to the individualistic aspect of this, which is, let's go ahead and understand where we're coming from, and are we willing to modify that, change it, tweak it, so that we're becoming closer, where we're becoming this anti-racist, multicultural society and organization. So I think that's a big one, is really looking at the individualistic aspect. And there are going to be some people who don't think this is an issue, and don't think that things need to change. And we have to decide if that's okay or not.
All right, everyone, we are going to end on that note. I seriously want to thank all of you for showing up. This is way bigger than, Stephanie, you and I planned. We're going to try to continue this conversation next Thursday. So those of you who can, those of you who are available, feel free to join. But from the bottom of my heart and Stephanie's, like, thank you so much for showing up. We really appreciate all your contributions. So take care.
Yeah, and then also reach out to us. Let us know how today went for you, other thoughts, suggestions. You know, Brian and I in the ChangeNerd community, we can really shape this and build a platform for us where all of your voices are heard and really amplified, and where we can really shape how change is led throughout organizations, how we really combat systemic racism. And we are the people to do it, right? We're change practitioners. We know how to lead large-scale change. So let's do it here. Please give us that feedback. Let us know how we can best support you as well.
Absolutely. All right. Take care, guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Everyone.